on free and reduced lunch. The orange bars are the percentage of students who pass with 3 or higher on AP exams. And as you can see, Whitman High School has the highest test scores and almost no students on reduced lunch. And that was intentional, wasn't it? Next slide. And people have worked very hard to preserve that access. Montgomery County has done a county-wide boundary study since the 1980s. What they do are these little piecemeal boundaries where they'll redraw a boundary here or there. And this is from a study done a couple of years ago about school boundaries. They basically calculated all of the different boundary changes that have been done in the past 40 years. Where I live and where I grew up over here, they've changed boundaries 40 times in the past 40 years. The Whitman cluster, 2 times. The school has simultaneously received 5 additions since it was built in 1962. As it continues to grow and the parents have the power and the capacity to demand better and more resources for their kids. Next slide. This is really a lot of money that's spent. You know, the taxpayer dollars are spent on expanding the school over and over again, but they do it for a reason, which is that parents fight very hard to keep it this way. This was from a meeting 3 years ago for the county's school boundary analysis, in which 400 angry, mostly white parents crowded a school cafeteria one late night in December to scream and yell and heckle the presenters to the point where one woman cried. And the handful of people who had the bravery to stand up and speak against it, such as this young woman who I gave a ride to the metro afterwards, stood up and said, you know, why you should care about diversity. These parents booed her. Next slide.
They booed her in 2019.
They booed her in 2019. So while the county is not changing its school boundaries and putting a lot of additions on schools, the other tool that it uses to deal with school capacity issues is just not allowing new homes in the catchments where schools are too crowded. This policy was just finally struck down about last year, but for a very long period of time, you actually could not build new houses in parts of Bethesda where Whitman is located because the school was too crowded.
But not countywide.
But not countywide. So you could build houses in other parts of the county where they had built a new school or where the schools are less sought after, where they had extra capacity. Next slide. And so this was the way things were until about 2 years ago. After the murder of George Floyd, there was a shocking, to me, like awakening in the county. This is a protest in front of Bethesda Library where 1,000 people showed up a week after to basically protest, essentially. And students from Whitman High School came and parents from the school came to talk about the racist culture of that school and how it needed to change. And students and former alumni at Whitman came out and said, we need to redistrict this high school. And so the idea was hopefully this would give a lot of momentum to redrawing school boundaries in the area. It didn't, unfortunately. But we learned a couple of things from that. This is the last slide, the next one. Number 1, zoning, school boundaries contribute a lot to inequity. Like zoning, wealthy communities use school boundaries to hoard their resources. Unlike zoning, it turns out that diverse schools might have an existing constituency, whether it's people who were, who got woke to this in 2020, or, this is a progressive community, and there are other tools that we've used to integrate schools, like magnets or school choice programs. Montgomery County was one of the first public school systems in the nation to get federal funding for school choice within the school system in the 1990s. The challenge is that constituency doesn't always understand how housing relates to schools. These are generally very progressive people who know that diverse integrated schools are good, but also have a healthy distrust of developers. And so that is the sort of bridge that I've been trying to build over the past 9 years, is not just how you bring YIMBYs to schools, but how you bring school people to YIMBY. All right, thank you so much, Cassie.
Well, I think that I would love to hear more about that sort of thinking you've done around messaging and how to sort of bridge these gaps. And I know you just spoke a lot, but if we can ask you to speak a little more, would you keep going on that last thought?
Yeah. So, like I said, in 2013, my brother was looking for high schools. He had a choice of 3 different high schools, as I did when I was in 8th grade. And in the process of helping him understand which of the 3 high schools he picked, I started doing this deep dive into school demographics and equity within schools, and basically started writing about it on my blog and putting together, a presentation that really struck a chord with community members. At the time, the current superintendent, Dr. Josh Starr, who sent his kids to Whitman, was vehemently opposed to any conversation about segregation in those schools. Like, this had been a recurring issue for years. You could not call Montgomery County schools segregated. But parents who had kids in the school system understood this fundamentally. Kids who grew up in Montgomery County understood this fundamentally. All you had to do was say to somebody which high school you went to, and they could immediately slot you in the hierarchy of neighborhoods and wealth and power in the community. And so that led to a group of community members and I basically starting an organization around school equity issues in 2013. We endorsed candidates for the 2014 school board elections, and we actually got a candidate elected who would have otherwise been the 5th vote Dr. Starr needed to have his contract renewed, and then he subsequently resigned. So we showed within a year that we could build a coalition around the schools are fucked up and we need to fix that. And it is we're still trying to figure out how we can actually tie that to housing. Because like I said, one of the recurring issues in a county like Montgomery County that is still growing and has, urban and suburban rural areas is some of the schools are overcrowded in some areas, some of the schools have capacity in other areas, and we can't change it. So people who are concerned about overcrowded schools are naturally inclined to say, well, shouldn't we not allow people to move into this community? And they're not necessarily, they may be doing it from a point of exclusion, but they're also doing it from a very practical concern, which is that they don't want 42 kids in their kids' class. So.
Yeah, and the overcrowding issue gets complicated also because sometimes there's like students overcrowding, but then sometimes you have more, maybe less sympathetic, like, oh, just be a lot of traffic, that would be a lot more, congestion at certain hours of the day and so, yeah, figuring out how to sort of have that conversation and deal with the concerns that range from like more, but as you were saying, like those are the kinds of issues that really like mobilize people, especially, regardless of your parents. So we're probably gonna come back to this. Maybe you guys have questions, but I want to turn to Courtney for a little bit. Courtney, in her work for the school district, sort of has led the school district in directions that you don't always see school districts going, and on issues of housing policy. So I would love for you to tell the group a little bit about some of the legislation that you guys took, and also sort of, I'm curious, did you face any pushback for doing that? I know there are people who often say, stay in your lane. School should be doing education stuff only. Don't, how broad your reach of policy can go can be.
So it's interesting, this conversation started, what pushed me to say, hey, we should support this bill around housing. And the district lobbies in Salem, which is our state capital, obviously, and then I do our state lobby work, our local government work, state agency relationships, and federal as well. When it comes to the legislature, we do generally lobby for, probably the biggest thing we do is school funding, right? Because in Oregon, much like in California, we limited property taxes long ago. So we haven't funded schools, for a generation, since I was probably 10. I think that's when the ballot measure passed, when I was 10. So you can see how long it's been. I'm 41, I'll just tell you. That way you don't have to try to do math. Anyway, so we've underfunded schools, so a big push for the district is constantly trying to get more, whether that's in just per pupil costs or additional funding sources for, right now we're really focused on funding streams that are tied to accountability related to equity, right? That's hopefully what a lot of blue states are doing. We don't know what red states, actually we do know what red states are doing, but we don't have to talk about education policy. We could be here all day for that, and I'm sure you guys are interested in it. But so anyway, pivoting back, the reason I got involved in the housing bill in 2019, House Bill 2001, was because I had a kitchen table conversation with my husband, who was here earlier moderating a panel in this room, I think, same last name. We just had to trade off kids today because it's a snow day. We were talking about it, and we talk a lot about this because we have skin in the game. We're in the district now. We have a kid, and we didn't have in Portland, you do have some choices. I would argue too many, Scott, but a lot of people have a lot of. It's not his fault. I'm joking with him. a lot of people have a lot of options to send their special snowflake to a special program. And I'm saying that this is me talking. I get to say this. I'm Courtney, but I do work for the district, but I think that the superintendent would agree with me. We let people travel across town to go to a special program or a language immersion program if they get into it through the lottery. A lot of people have chosen not to stay in their neighborhood school because they look at greatschools.org and they say, oh, it's 2 out of 10, I'm out. Because I have, guess what, the money to go buy a house in a different neighborhood. And so we've had this conversation a lot over time because to us it was, and I don't need an award, but to me it was like, why don't you just go to the school 4 blocks away? That's easier. It's more diverse. And again, 4 blocks, he can walk to school. I walked to school growing up. It's special to be able to walk to your school. You don't have to go on a bus for an hour to some other place with kids that don't live in your neighborhood. So we had this conversation as a couple, and kind of became no question that he was going to go to the neighborhood school. Well, come to find out, many of my neighbors in my Northeast Portland modest neighborhood left when their kids were entering kindergarten and decided that they wanted to move to the west side where houses cost $1 million+ and they could afford to buy one, and left. And I got kind of bitter about it. I was like, why are they leaving this little magical school over here? And I did use the word racist at the kitchen table with my husband, but and I'm saying that out loud because I do think that is a lot of it, and it really pisses me off, and it pissed me off as a mom, and so that's when I said, hey guys, should we do that? And we were talking about it, and he said, I think we were just talking about the bill in general, and I said, oh, maybe should the district weigh in? And my husband's not my boss, and he was like, I think you guys should get involved because he does this stuff for fun. And so that's when I went. To my boss at the time. She's no longer at the district, and I said, "Hey, I really think that we should submit testimony on this bill. It's important because the more single-family homes you have in a neighborhood, the more white that neighborhood's going to be. It's just socioeconomics in this city." And so she was gung-ho about it. She thought it was a great way to exert some different pressure from a school district instead of just the usual suspects, which God bless them all. And so that's when I decided to just put something out there that wasn't maybe the same thing that they've all heard before. So that's why we got involved. I think, we all do things because we have a personal opinion about it, and we push a little harder when it's personal. And so I think that's why I wanted to do it. But we have a lot of issues as a district, and I want Scott to weigh in because he was really active in what we call DBRAC, which is the District Boundary Review Advisory Committee, because we need a lot of alphabet soup in school districts. We have so many acronyms, and I know he's sweating because he has PTSD about it, because it's just it's very similar to what happened in Montgomery County around, anytime you talk about school boundaries, people freak out, they show up, they're loud, they're mean, they boo people, which is bullshit, especially if it's a student. I'm just going to say it. And so I just have a lot of feelings about it, but I think Scott has a lot more.
Courtney, yeah.
Sorry, I'm just here. I'm just gonna.
Woo! Yeah. So the whole boundary thing. As a citizen activist, I testified in 2010 to the district saying, look at this. See, these school enrollments are way out of whack. We have all these under-enrolled schools. We have all these crowded schools. We need to do the whole thing because it's so off. And I got a no, and then we got the no, we're going to do it one piece at a time. While some of us were saying it's a system. If you do something over here, it limits what you can do over. We lost that battle. And so they did one little boundary change, and it was all very happy because it was 2 very similar socioeconomic schools. And then we did another one that blew up halfway through because some parents' communications dealing with race were exposed. It was pretty clear. And so they took some time off, and everybody was kind of chastened, and so they did the boundary change. And then then came the Jefferson clusterfuck. Since Courtney has led the way with the F word, we're here. Yeah. So Jefferson High School, and I don't know how many of you are from Portland know any of the sordid racist history of education in our city. It goes way back. Well, yeah, it's everything. Jefferson in northeast Portland was historically the African American district. It's where, in Albina, where blacks were forced to live, and it had. I mean, Portland is gentrified, and so they were losing students who lived in there, and other students were using choice to get out, and it was a complete disaster in a whole lot of ways. And they decided, okay, we're going to do some boundaries and fix things. Oh, by the way, we may close a school or two. Yeah. And so they did all these crazy scenarios, and people just lined up, just reaming them out. And they went through a process. And, oh yeah, the process started with, do you guys have a plan? No, we don't have a plan. This is going to be steered by the community. And the second meeting, somebody came and says, guess what I found on the website? It's a plan. And the two of you leading the process put that plan together. So it started off with a bald-faced lie. And so they went through this process, all these meetings, people denouncing the district, and they said, okay, you know what? We're just going to do the original plan. So much for public process. That's when I got involved and pulled together a small group of people, and we did a summary of this is actually what people are saying. And surprisingly, the superintendent and the school board, out of 11 recommendations, did approve 7 of them. This was in 2013. And one of them was, we're going to do a district-wide boundary redraw. Now, the purpose of that was not to be able to create schools that were balanced in terms of demographics, because housing is so segregated. You could nibble around the edges, and also gentrification was happening so quickly. You might go, yay, we have a really balanced, diverse school here, and within 3 years it could be just, the tsunami could have come in. And but what's happened is that lower income, smaller enrollment schools don't have economies of scale. And so if you're funding schools on a per student basis, in terms of assigning teachers, they get less resources. And so that was really, for me, the bigger equity piece. And it was part of what I ran on. And I got on the school board, and we started these processes, and I'm sorry, it's been not successful. It's been kind of a shit show.
I think a lot of that, being on the inside, is with the Southeast. We've been doing a boundary review in Southeast Portland for the last probably year. And every time they get to a point with recommendations, there's some family, privileged family, I might add, that says, that's not the recommendation we want. And so they go back to the drawing board, and it's the same, it's infuriating, because it's the loudest, most resourced families that keep saying, no, we don't like this option. You just don't want to move. You don't want your kids to go to a different building.
Yeah, I mean,
you're going to live in the same house.
That comes up, and you sort of mentioned it, Scott, but like a community-led process. What is that? Who ends up leading those processes? Like, whose voices end up being privileged? It's very similar to the same sorts of dynamics we see within there's zoning reform and saying we need to have community stakeholder engagement, but the people. I think about this as a journalist. I'm aware. I think about like how stories get, how people sort of play to the dynamics of media, and how drama, tension is central to what people look for. And so I sort of think when we are covering these kinds of meetings and moments, to be really, really careful at the very, very easy way it can be to say, oh, and 30 people showed up with signs protesting the proposal. And you can make that so central, even though really, like, how many people do they represent? Maybe in terms of school boundaries, it's, they might, like, obviously there are lots of people who oppose these things, but I think just in the same way, you know, certain loud homeowners at city council meetings tend to, you know, yes, like, take it as a given that there's going to be people speaking out in opposition to any attempt to redraw boundaries anytime you do it. But how much, like, do they really represent the broader community when you write your story, I think is something that, like, media could do a better job of. And, you know, I think advocates just, going into those moments being like, oh, we're obviously, like, you know, the sun's going to rise. There's going to be a community pushing back in testimony. What else do we need in this situation? Scott, I would love to ask, like, I know you said it has not been successful, but is there, like, what do you, if you could go back and lead the process again based on what you saw, do you think anything else would help it?
So, partly it's public process is hard in the best of times, and especially with race becoming much more of a visible issue, that plays out all sorts of ways, often not very good, or not very constructive, I would say. It's the difference of doing public process in knowing if you've been involved in public process, you've kind of seen that continuum of what do you say, this is your decision, or this is what we want input on, or that continuum. And the process that we've used has given, I think, hasn't matched that up well. The community should not be making technical decisions, and a lot of boundary stuff is very technical. The community should be very clear about what the values are and broad outcomes should be. What should a good solution look like in terms of those values? And what's happened is that the district has empowered community level groups, and use that. I've been on all sorts of flavors of those. That balance has not been there. They've had to make too many technical decisions, and there's I'm a numbers guy. There's a lot of numbers involved. If you're not a numbers person, it's really challenging. So I think that how that process was constructed, because we're ending up, part of what we're doing also is undoing a pretty disastrous, we converted a bunch of K-5s in middle schools to K-8s a number of years ago, mostly doing that in poorer neighborhoods. And undoing that has been positive, and there are actually some positive things coming out of that. But
Some K-8s are awesome. In my neighborhood, the ones that have stuck around, there are some benefits, but depending on the superintendent,
right, but again, the scale has been so bad that the
yes.
number of kids in the middle grades has been so low
yeah.
that they don't get that
The
broad
most
spectrum
options.
of electives when you can go to our version of a Whitman middle school, and I don't mean to put them down, but they've got 1,000 kids there, twice as many as
Yeah.
East Side middle schools, and the range of options there for kids is embarrassing and shameful.
Dan, you have some thoughts on this, but I think to bring it back to housing and the questions around housing supply, I think something that maybe this is something would be helpful for the YIMBY community to be consciously thinking about a little more, is like, it's so hard to build any new housing at all, but how do we have the conversation around, housing for people with multiple children or people who want to start families? Are we building those housing? Where are we building those housing? How is that shaping the conversation around development and school construction? And as it's overlapped, especially in these overcrowded, in some places, traffic, et cetera. So I don't know, Dan, how is that playing out in, you don't have to just speak about Maryland. I know you follow national stuff too.
I mean, I think one of the challenges in like urban versus suburban school districts is that like in big suburban school districts like Montgomery County, which is 1 million people, like most of the housing is, well, 48% of the homes are single family detached homes, right? If families want a house that is big enough for them and they can afford it, they can find one. The challenge, I think the conversation that's happening on the planning side that the school side is not really privy to is that the fastest growing parts of the county are the walkable urban parts. And the schools are school enrollment is starting to catch up to that, but a lot of that growth is not people with kids. So the school system is starting to understand like, well, some families with kids are coming back to these areas and we do need more school capacity and maybe we need to have more smaller urban school footprints. So like, that's a conversation that's happening, which brings, up the new, like, well, how do you put a school in this place? And like, now you have to deal with school NIMBYs, which are an entirely different creature. But one thing I wanted to touch on, because we've talked a lot about like the inside baseball of school board politics, is how dramatically different it is than like zoning board politics, right? And that's like for I think people who are in that realm who want to jump over to schools, like understanding it, right? I don't know if it's the case in Portland, but what I'm hearing sounds very similar. Like, the county council and planning department have lots of staff that help the people who make the decision. The school board does not. Each school board member, they're elected, they have a very small salary, they have no staff. It is basically what the in Montgomery County is $25,000 a year, which is a lot. It's zero. Right. They basically, the superintendent and the central office tell the school board what to vote on, and then they do. And then you have the teachers union, which in many communities like mine is extremely powerful and influential.
And here.
Right? They hand out a thing called the Apple ballot, which teachers volunteer to go to the polling place and hand it out. And like you wouldn't cross your kid's teacher, right? Like you would vote for everyone on the thing that the teacher gives you. And so it's ironically a much more top-down form of decision making. And the flip side is you have a very significant core of like citizen activists. It sounds like yourself, who have to go through all of the data and all of the little minutia of school stuff to do the research that is not being given them otherwise, which in zoning land, we have the luxury of like, they put the planning reports on the website and like, here's all the information about the zoning approvals and how many they've got, how many they got in the pipeline and everything. Oh, it's wonderful. School stuff is I have a 560-page PDF of every school in the county that I have to enter into a spreadsheet so I can make that graph that I made just behind me there. So it's
It's true. Everything's in a friggin' PDF.
So it is a lot more work for perhaps less return on investment. And to your point, Rachel, about like this being like the pink thing, right? Like school politics are heavily dominated by parents and specifically women with kids. And that is a very different dynamic than we often see in like YIMBY land. And so the messaging has to be different too. Like, what are people's motivations? And then of course there is the big gatekeeper, which is you don't have any kids. Like I've been told so many times, I don't have any kids. Why do you care about this? Why are you even getting involved? And it doesn't matter that I went to Montgomery County schools. It doesn't matter that my brother was in Montgomery County schools until 5 years ago. It doesn't matter that I live 2 blocks away from an elementary school that I take my dog to every morning to walk around and poop next to the principal's car, because that's where he likes to poop. So much so I gave money to the PTA. Like, I don't have any kids, so it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
I think another interesting, and it's sort of to housing, but it's is school foundations, and I don't know what that looks like in Montgomery
boy.
County, but that's a really interesting dynamic too. If you have in PPS, we have certain schools that have very active school foundations, right? Parents pull together a big event. There's a lot of Nike executives that go there, and they give lots of money, and they raise a shitload of money, and they can pay for a freaking teacher, an FTE, and then several.
An elementary school that got a planetarium.
Yeah, it's insane. And then you go to, and we're working on this at the district to rein it in a little bit and have, an equity formula. So if you raise more than $10,000, a third of what you raise goes to a pot, and that pot gets distributed to schools that need more because they don't have parents that can pull it together. Because, I don't know, people are working their full-time job or multiple full-time jobs. Who has time to sit on a parent foundation just to get extra money for something that is not, and I'm just going to defend the district and all districts, is not the district's fault. It's the state's fault for not funding schools. So the problem is not, you didn't give us enough money for our half-time art teacher. The problem is we didn't fund schools for 30 years, and now we're making up for it. And we can't make up for it with these piecemeal things. And shortchanging students of color in the process, honestly. And so the only way really to get at it is to, in my opinion, parents should go to Salem or Annapolis? Okay, I did take social studies. Annapolis, yeah, I got it. And you got to lobby there and say, my kids, whether it's your kid or the neighbor kid or some other kid, they're not getting what they deserve because we've underfunded schools for so long. And so I know that's not, I'm going to bring it back to housing. And actually, I have an example of something interesting that we're working on that's related to housing policy. So we talked about gentrification. It's happening in most major cities. A lot of our families that are families of color have left Portland. They can't afford to live in the center city, Albina neighborhood. They can't afford to live there anymore. Who can afford to buy a house in Portland right now? I mean, it's crazy. The average housing prices are $500,000 or more. It's a really hard, the starting point is really, it's a tough, I think I spent too much time with my kids earlier and my brain is fried, but it's a really hard entry point to come in and buy a house here. So, and this is just one example of lots of cities. My brother lives in San Francisco. It's obviously insane down there. But what we're trying to do is allow for families who have been displaced because of housing affordability or housing reasons to come back and go to a school in the district. We call it the right to return policy. It's not really a policy yet because we don't have anything on the books, and the reason is we can't ask for housing. We can't ask for that information. It's illegal, and so we're trying to figure out a short circuit way with the state, potentially at a rules level, to allow somebody who's in a neighboring district or even beyond the neighboring district to come back and go maybe to Jefferson High School. If they have a family legacy at that high school, why shouldn't they be able to go there if there's room for them to go there? So we're trying to figure that out. And I think a lot of, at the state level, they're saying, well, there's just not that many kids that are going to take advantage of it. Why do we need a state policy? Because there's at least a few. So that's why. And so we're working through that actually really right now. We're waiting to hear back from them. But I think that's another example of ways that we can allow people to come back to where they have that family history. But it's around displacement. And the Portland Housing Bureau has language around this. If you can use displacement as a marker, then that's not illegal. So we're trying to figure out how we might be able to model that after the city's housing policy. But it's just tricky because people are like, well, what, can't they just go to the school, the district they're in? And it's like, well, yeah, obviously they are. But what if we allowed them to take advantage of where they're from?
Another piece of the housing thing is, there's a Portland plan now for building more housing. And how much of that is subsidized multi-bedroom homes? Because that's where we get kids. And if we don't have that, if we get... now there's a lot of ADUs being built, and they're not going to be very many kids living in ADUs, if any. A handful. So that's really, for me, as far as I know, that's if we want to maintain our city as a place where you can raise a family, we have to have that kind of construction. Where there's available land to build those kind of things, again, gets back to our segregated city. Yeah.
Just that Dan said, and then and sort of observation, and then open it up to you guys. I really take your point that school boards they're not the same as city councils. There are different dynamics, and we need to be more clear on the differences. I probably need to be a little more clear on the differences. I think it's still helpful, though, to recognize some of the similar dynamics between these two places, because I think a lot of the gatekeeping can be very similar in the same sense that YIMBYs are trying to advocate for the people who don't yet live there but want to live there. There's going to be a lot of parents who try to say, you have no stake in this school or the future of this school because I'm the current customer of that school, get out. But anyone in a community has a stake in the school that's in the center of their community. It's going to be there. The parents telling you that you don't have a say now is going to be out in a couple of years. These are institutions that are, here for future generations as well. I think also something I've noticed is that, maybe people in the YIMBY community, they say, I don't know everything, but I know we need to build more housing equitably. Like, that is something I feel comfortable advocating. Education policy, I'm not quite sure. I don't know. Is it like, I don't even know if integration is the right move. Maybe we should do more charters or vouchers or, and they feel like they can't get involved in schools without having like a super masterful analysis of where, but like, I think that there are, and this is what Scott was getting at, like, there are certain values around a school community that like anybody can be sort of weighing in on, and you don't, and a lot of the sort of attempts to say, like, you need to have your fully fleshed dissertation of where you think, the school district's policy should be in 10 years is the only place for you to be weighing in on these conversations about schools. Like, that is just, like, that's not true, and that's kind of a way to just keep the conversation more narrow and keep people out.
I totally agree with you, but I think you're also touching on, like, sort of the central tension I see between, like, school people and, like, housing people.
Yeah.
One of which is just, like, how do you view, like, the government's role in providing things, right? Like, a lot of the conversation around housing is about essentially deregulating it, right? Like, having fewer restrictions on building homes. The school system obviously has a very large hand of government in things, and, like, at its best, I personally think that, school boundaries are decisions about, what an ideal community looks like, but in a very different mechanism. Urbanists talk a lot about the desire they want kids to be able to walk to schools, but in America of 2022, what that means is children are walking to segregated schools. And so one of the ways we have around that, which is redrawing school boundaries so that students may be more mixed up, AKA busing, or magnet schools, like, is that anti-urbanism, right? I actually don't have an answer for that, but which is to say that, like, it's not that I necessarily think that YIMBYs have to have fully formed opinions before showing up at the school board, but that, like, some of the things that we talk about and some of the things that school advocates are talking about, like, oftentimes align and oftentimes are very far apart. And figuring, I don't like to use the word balance or compromise. I don't know they're always true, but, like, ideally housing, better housing policy addresses the school boundary policy, but, like, which, ideally they both happen, but, like, if they don't, how do we make it work?
No, very, very well said. I think, so we have about 20 minutes left. I'd love to hear from you guys. You guys can direct your questions to whoever you want. Stand up and introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Joan Pettit. I'm a PPS parent, and I live in inner northeast Portland and helped, just to give you all some context, was one of the parents who helped work to reopen Tubman.
Yeah.
So, and my kids are black and went to Boise Elliott, and it seems to me, and this is exactly the conversation I wanted to hear, so thank you, Joanna. But it seems to me that the link, when we're talking about housing and schools, is racism and white supremacy.
Yep.
I have seen so many white parents who move into these gentrifying neighborhoods who will twist themselves into knots to tell you all the reasons they aren't sending their kids to the neighborhood elementary school. And it always adds up to the same thing. They're scared to have their kids, their white kids, in school with a lot of black and brown kids. Like, there's a certain number where it's okay, right? And then there's, like, this threshold. And this, I see this happening a lot, even with people who I think are truly, genuinely progressive, but there's something about when it's their own kids that a lot of that, it's like the real fear comes out. So I think, to me, it's just like, it's racism. It's racism.
Yep.
At the end, it's like why we have all these freeways. It's why we have, it's what's driving, it's what happened with Jefferson, and all that stuff. Is it something else? Isn't that the leader?
Our school boundary fight happened the same time as the summer of protests after George Floyd, right? There were 4 and 5 protests a day for a month in Montgomery County, all over the county. And I was just waiting for one of these parents who was all bent out of shape about their kid being redistricted, telling me that they couldn't say anything about them because I went to a Black Lives Matter protest. I marched down the middle of Rockville Pike holding hands with somebody, and you're going to tell me I'm racist
have a
because
sign in my
I
yard.
don't want my kid to go to a different school. And like that, like what it means to what you're saying is it's true, and that means twice the discomfort, twice the awkwardness, 2 conversations that you have to have. You made 2 choices about where you live and where you send your kids to school, and wow.
It says a lot about people. I mean, I don't know. I've heard your name, Joan. It's nice to see you here. In a good way. That's a good thing. And I think it was related to the I-5 project. And I think, you know, I just, as a mom, and and a lot of friends who, by the way, a lot of my friends my age have chosen not to be parents, which I find fascinating. It's a large number of people are not having kids in this city, which is, I alluded to earlier, our enrollment is going down. And a lot of people thought, oh, it's COVID, and people have left, you know, they're sending their kids to privates, which is certainly happening because they had that choice, and some of the private schools stayed open or made it easier, I guess, made it easier for families during the last couple of years. But really, it's also changing you know, people are they're buying single family homes, but they're not putting kids in them.
Fertility rate.
Yeah.
Sonoma County is 1.2.
Yeah, it's really low.
2 is a little over 2 just to keep a constant population.
Yeah.
It's like Japan or.
So to wrap it up, is a lot of people that I know have done just that. Like, I'm just not sure about that school because of the score, and they get fixated on the score. And we all know the score is just socioeconomics, and it's, you know, it doesn't really mean much. Test scores, we all know that's another. What does that mean? What does that mean? You know, it's a one point in time moment, and then they, you know, wrap it up into everything else. So I think a lot of people are doing that, and I agree with you. It's really frustrating.
There was a book I read last year for book club. It came out, it's called Learning in Public, Lessons for a Racially Divided America from My Daughter's School by Courtney Martin. It was like, I was sort of ambivalent going into it. It's about, she's a writer in San Francisco and a mom, and it was very publicly sort of like honestly chronicling with her choices about making schools and like interviewing other parents about why. Yeah, I don't know if you know that book, but I thought it was worth it. Aaron?
Thank you. This is awesome. I've been having this conversation in my head for the last decade. I was taking notes in the DBRAC meetings that Scott was at and just watching this guy go, oh my God, this is the question I have is sort of, I feel like I'm hearing that we need a YIMPS movement, like a yes in my public schools. and aside from the fact it's a funny word, it's getting at this notion that if YIMBY is about being proactive on like at its best, but YIMBY isn't always, but what we're aiming for, being like we're actively fighting exclusionary systemic crap, and I'm going to make things slightly more uncomfortable and leverage my privilege for a more inclusive, tolerant society where people are closer to me than people don't look like me. And the question is for Rachel, but maybe for all of you, like Rachel, I know you've been following some of the national stuff on this. Like, what are the best success stories of like a yes in my public school movement, or like what are the characteristics of like those badass parents that are doing that? And maybe there aren't, I don't know, but just sort of, if there was to be a germination of that, like what does that need to look like and how does it happen?
That's a good question. I feel like I should write a story on this now that you've pitched it to me. I think, so, you know, I did some reporting on like school integration politics in Connecticut, where there's a lot of, so that was a really instructive place for me, because you go there and the towns there's so many towns, there's like 165, or they're very small, they're like extremely short distances apart from each other, but they've all the same language about traveling on a bus, and like, oh, you want me to drive 15 minutes to like there, you know, the kind of ride where like I took a 20-minute bus ride and that's normal, but like just the sense of scale, you sort of see how it gets distorted whatever community you're talking about, and they all use sort of similar arguments regardless of actual facts on grounds. I think, but it was interesting talking to people there who've been working on this for a long time. The Poverty, Race, and Research Action Council is this awesome organization led by Phil Tegler, who splits his time between Connecticut and DC. And, you know, like, I think preferences of parents, especially, and I think Dan was getting at this sort of, like, it's easy to kind of describe the school politics landscape as if it's just like 1975 and everyone's protesting Brown v. Board, but like there are some different things going on. Like Gen X parents, like, people don't actually they are sort of worried about their kid only being surrounded by other white kids and sorry, the white parents saying that. And I think I think there is a lot of more organization that like pro-public school groups need. I think teacher unions have not had much leadership in this area at all. But I also think that there are a lot of people who kind of like want to be told like what should I do here? Like, what is the right way? How do I do this? And you're balancing it with like the overarching pressure that like families have, where they just feel like we have this narrative in the U.S. and this is something that is explored pretty well in the book I mentioned, just like that the pro-social thing to do is just to worry about the chances of your own kid, that like it is the like social justice moral thing to be like doing whatever it takes for your kid to be okay in life and their economic chances, and like it's not really your responsibility how other kids in your community do or the life. And I think trying to disrupt that and trying to make parents, like, just that we are in a community, and yes, obviously parents are going to care about their kids to a degree, perhaps more, but that we are all, that I think the single family home, nuclear family, only care about your kids' choices leads to a lot of public policy decisions that marginalize and continue to sort of keep people down, and we need to sort of like push back on that in a way that I think we have sort of treated that as like just the default. Of course you're not going to care about other kids, so that's not super, that's kind of my first off the cuff, but I should think about that more. Yeah.
I think the two things that I've learned in following this for the past 9 years is like appealing to people's values. And that means two things. One is that we were very lucky in our school board elections in 2020 that a lot of the anti-school redistricting candidate had a lot of support from like right-wing groups. Like when Paul Manafort's spokesperson comes to the school board to testify against redistricting his kids, like that is a gift. So that's one kind of values. The other is property values. And the narrative is people are paying the most to live near the best schools. And increasingly, and I imagine you see this in Portland too, like people are paying for something else, which is they want to be near stuff. Yeah. And so the fastest growing in Montgomery County, the fastest growing home prices are in school catchments that are close to the metro or walking distance to shops and jobs and all the other stuff, right? Not in places like the Whitman cluster, because Whitman cluster is fairly suburban and far from things, and there's only so far house prices can go there, right? And so you're showing like people will pay good money to live in this. Even if you get redistricted, like there's other things in your community that add value to your house, so you will probably be fine.
Or you just find a charter in there, you don't
Yeah,
have
that
to deal
too.
with the problem, which is what's happening here. Because it's the same here, where our unwalkable neighborhoods there's just not a lot of space there anymore to add more single family homes, but they're generally single family.
Let's be clear, charters are part of the racist issue around education. School choice, by and large, has, we know in Portland, and made schools more segregated. But yeah, sorry.
Kaz?
Hi, thank you so much. I'm from Massachusetts. I'm a former school committee member in Lawrence, Massachusetts, which is a district that's 90% Latinx. And I'm just curious, I come from like the ed justice organizing space, so I'm new to YIMBYism, and I've been trying to make a lot of connections, and one of the things I'm curious to hear your thoughts on is, for communities of color, particularly in my experience, we're seeing a lot of austerity in the face of like high stakes testing and accountability. We're seeing receiverships and takeovers of our school districts. I was a school committee member who didn't actually have any power, and we're seeing a lot more, appointed boards and things like that that are really disconnecting like the community process. On top of schools that are underfunded, there was a study that showed our school has been underfunded, the district, by at least $13 million. So I guess like my question is like, what relationship do you see between like housing policy and those type of things? And how do we like talk about it to bring the people that are mad about those things to like the YIMBY table?
Great question.
So I'm guessing if you're in a poor school district, that's part of housing segregation. I mean, that just as a way to open up to say, and here's the consequence of that for our school-age children and who are your future workers, you know, sorry, labor market economist, who you need to invest in, and you're shorting them $13 million, which I'm going to assume is a significant figure in a million here, a million there. Yeah, so I mean, that's a starter right there.
That's an argument we used a lot. Like, you know, the slogan we had for our school equity group was strong schools, strong neighborhoods, strong economy. And that was extremely resonant, both among black and brown parents who, you know, wanted better for their kids, but also, you know, a lot of white families who are white homeowners who had lived in that area for decades. And they were concerned about, they wanted to make sure that their homes were retaining their value, but also like the schools their kids went to 20 and 30 years ago were still as sought after as they were back when. You know, that they had a legacy and they had a tie to that community that meant something to them.
It's a great phrase.
Yeah, thank you.
So you mentioned the teachers unions and how much influence that they can influence in a lot of these in a lot of the school board elections and things like that. My question is like, how historically have they interacted with the sort of school NIMBYs? Like, where have they sort of sided on these issues in the past, and what would be the best ways to make inroads with them as coalition partners in sort of a youth movement?
In Montgomery County, they don't. The teachers union is primarily concerned about teacher salaries.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good question. I think everything's political. And it is, especially in the environment we've been in where it's been a bit scarce. Our, teachers are leaving the profession because it's been hard. This last couple of years has been brutal on them. It's been brutal on everybody, but it's been especially brutal on certain sectors, right? Teachers, healthcare workers, like people just everywhere. And, but I think, I don't know. I mean, you have to have trust first. And I know in Portland we have such a history of distrust between our union and our district. It goes back so far beyond any of the people that are sitting in their chairs right now. But it's hard to pull it back. And the minute you do anything that isn't to their liking, it's just so tense all the time. I mean, we're going to bargain that. We're going to bargain that. And I interned at NEA. I love teachers. I mean, but it's now being on this side of it, it's really interesting to watch what small things will lead to, a bargaining conversation. And so I think the foundation has to be trust, and that's hard to build, and it's hard to pull back for a generation of distrust. But I think, talking about how they do care about teachers, They do care about teacher salaries because that's their livelihood. They also do care about kids. Mm-hmm. And so how do we use it, it's like the heartstrings argument. I mean, people care about the future. You get one shot at kindergarten. You get one shot at first grade. Like, we're just missing it. Every year we miss another great, cohort. And so I think it's got to be urgent and timely and personal. And I think a lot of teachers do also send their kids to schools in the district. I don't know. It's a hard question to navigate. It's a good question.
I write about teacher unions a lot, and it's sort of following the moments when, teacher unions get allied in new causes. And so it's like a lot of times, there are a lot of young teachers. A lot of young teachers happen to have social justice, progressive values. They are the kinds of people who are actually could be very susceptible to organizing, and then they can be in a caucus in their union and pressure from a social justice. Maybe their union leadership has been president for decades, but that's how you have some unions taking on climate change and pushing their unions to do that, or doing there are tons of there's tons of little pockets of that all over, and I feel actually educators are really sort of
they can't afford to live in Portland.
Yeah, they want to live.
There's a housing angle right there.
They don't want to commute far to you can do it on the self-interest too of just commutes to their own schools, but I think your point is really good. They care about the kids' futures, and so there's a lot of, I think, organizing potential with teacher unions personally.
Climate change has to be part of the conversation with housing, and I think the latest IPCC report said something like no more single-family housing homes. Something I saw a quote like that. I haven't read the report or even the summary, but that's a big deal. we have a ton of teachers in Portland who actually, educators kind of drove our latest climate change policy that was just passed. That's another, to me, everything has to be viewed through that lens now, along with race.
Okay, we have two
And
more
there you
question
go.
times. Let's do to both of you guys.
Yeah, so I guess my question was, so like, I feel like socioeconomic segregation is sort of a thing like around the world. It's not just about the US and like our terrible housing policies and so on. So I was just wondering if any of you guys have any like positive examples of how other countries deal with this that you think we could learn from. Like how to make schools more integrated, I guess.
Well, in San Francisco, they just have a lottery, so everybody just goes wherever they get sent, and it could be completely across town, which, you know, that's a challenge for families, but it's a challenge for every family, not just certain families. So in some ways, it is the most, I mean, it's not, I'm sure lots of people that would argue with me, but I find that fascinating because you're literally just, it's even playing field. Here's your lottery, here's your school. Good luck with that school. You might get lucky and be at the one down the street, but you're probably gonna have to cross town. So that's one example of something very different, but interesting.
Louisville, Kentucky, and Louisville, Kentucky has, it's a countywide school.
Jefferson County?
Jefferson County, because they merged. They divide the county up into these basically like chunks, right? Like 5 chunks, and each chunk has a couple of high schools, a couple of middle schools, and a bunch of elementary schools, and you get to pick of any of them. So
Within
like,
the chunk.
Within the chunk. So like you are guaranteed that you will be within the school within a couple of miles of your house, and you have a bunch of choices. And that seems like a way to address it. Like, so your kid might have to travel a little bit, but it's not super far. We kind of do that in Montgomery County, but only, of course, in the parts that aren't as rich, and only with high schools.
So frustrating.
I mean, Charlotte had an experiment for a couple of years that seemed to work, and then new school board went back to the good old ways.
Oh yeah, Wake County in North Carolina has something like that too, and they also, like the school board flipped. Republicans, they scrapped it and then they flipped again, put it back. But there's a book called The Best Schools in the Nation. I think that's literally what it's called, and it's about Wake County public schools.
Okay, do you just want to let's get your question, then we'll wrap. Yeah.
Sure, I'm wondering if either Montgomery County or the Portland Public Schools have had success building teacher housing. I come from a really white, affluent suburb of the Bay Area. The only way to break through the cognitive dissonance of parents there is to tell them the teachers can't afford to live in their city.
I don't think there's anything successful yet, but I know that there's a project so we mentioned the Albina neighborhood, which is in inner northeast, near Tubman, near the freeway, near the Rose Quarter where the Blazers play. Sorry, Moda Center. I like Rose Quarter better. I hate all these companies taking stadiums over. And anyway, they're doing a redevelopment of this neighborhood. So there's an organization called the Albina Vision Trust. I highly recommend looking at their website. They're doing really great things. And one of the things that they've contemplated is developing some teacher housing or educator housing in that area. I don't know where that's going. I don't even know the status of it. I don't want to speak for them, but I think Winta from their organization is on a panel. They're great, so I would, maybe connect with them.
We actually kicked around that idea when talking about Concordia.
My neighbor.
I have some mixed feelings about that concept. I think it's not, but
It is hard.
it is politically it's an interesting thing about, but also it's like there's so many essential workers that we want to be able to afford to live.
I think
in the
it's,
community.
when you're talking about the police force or any other, sort of first responders, like requiring them to live in the community in which they serve, that's great if you subsidize it, right? And I think it's the same for educators. If we're not paying them enough to be able to afford a modest home or more, because they're doing really important work, then we're not doing everything right, and we got to get creative. But again, it's all about resources, and it's scarce, and there's so many priorities, and that's why schools have been underfunded. It's why we haven't had enough of this. It's why we haven't had enough of that, and so it takes vision. Albina Vision Trust, and it takes it really does. It takes vision. It takes hard work. These things don't happen overnight. It's a lot of patience. It's hard to wait for the good stuff to come. But
I like
I don't
this
know.
idea of like figuring out YIMPs. I don't know if we'll keep the name. We
Yeah,
might
YIMPs.
rename it, but I think it's good.
Please no.
Thank you guys so much for coming. I hope it was.